You won $240,000 in the lottery. You decided to deposit some of it in a savings account earning 2% interest, and you put the rest into a certificate of deposit that pays 3% interest. If you earned $5,600 in interest after 1 year, how much should you deposit in each account? Because this problem asks how much you deposited in each account, we're going to let those be represented by the variables x and y. It looks like you deposited some in a savings account and some in a certificate of deposit, also called a CD. So let's let the amount invested in savings be x, and then let's let the amount invested in a CD, CD stands for certificate of deposit, let's let that be y. Again, because this is an interest problem, we're going to want to organize our information in a table. Just like the other interest problems, we're going to use a 2x3 table. On the top, we're going to label the columns principal, rate, and interest, just like last time. And we'll remember that the relationship between those quantities is principal times rate equals interest. This comes into play later. Now, when we're labeling the left-hand side of the rows, we look at the two types of accounts that you deposited your money in, and there is a savings account and also a CD, that certificate of deposit. And now we have to fill in the information in the table. We'll start in the upper left-hand corner. The principal for the savings account, remember principal is the amount you invested, well, that's going to be x, because in our first let statement, we wrote let the amount invested in savings be x. So that's represented by x. And the principal in the CD, the amount you invested in the CD, we said was y. Now, if we look at the rates, the interest rate for the savings account was 2%. As a decimal, that's 0.02. For the CD, the rate was 3%. And as a decimal, that's 0.03. And again, to figure out what goes in the interest column, we multiply across, because principal times rate gives us interest. So for the savings account, x times 0.02 is 0.02x. Y times 0.03 is 0.03y. And now that we've filled in the information in our table, we need to write two equations that model the situation. And there's two pieces of information we haven't used yet. First, $240,000 represents your total winnings in the lottery. Lucky you. And since you deposited that money in these two accounts, that's going to be a principal. In fact, the total principal. So I'm going to put that at the bottom of the principal column, $240,000. The other number that we haven't used yet is $5,600, and we're told that that's the total interest, so we'll put that in the bottom of the interest column. One of the most common mistakes I see students make with problems like these is they switch those two numbers. They take the 5,600 and instead of putting it in the interest column, they move it to the principal, and they take the 240,000 and move it to the interest. You have to make sure you understand which is the principal and which is the interest so that you match them up appropriately. Now we're ready to write our system of equations. The first one's going to come from the principal column because x was the amount you invested in savings and y was the amount you invested in the CD, and the total you invested was $240,000. That means that x plus y has to be equal to $240,000. The second equation comes from the interest column because 0.02x and 0.03y were the amounts of interest for each account, and the total interest was 5,600, we know that 0.02x plus 0.03y equals 5,600. Now that we have our system of equations we have to solve, and again we'll use substitution. We can isolate either x or y in the first equation to do our substitution, but the math is always just a little bit easier if you look at the other equation and find the variable that has the smaller coefficient. Because 0.02 is smaller than 0.03, it's easiest if we isolate x in the first equation, and it just ends up working out that we avoid a negative sign, which makes the math just a little bit easier. So let's isolate x. To get x alone in the first equation, we have to subtract y on both sides. That gives us x equals 240,000 minus y. And then, wherever we see an x in the second equation, we can replace it with 240,000 minus y. So let's do that substitution. We end up with 0.02, and then instead of x, we're going to multiply that by 240,000 minus y. Be careful that you have the right amount of zeros. If you miss one of those, you make a big mistake. Plus 0.03y equals 5,600. At this point, we have to distribute the 0.02. When we do that, 0.02 times 240,000 is 4,800. So we have 4,800 minus 0.02y plus 0.03y equals 5,600. Next, we can combine like terms. Negative 0.02y plus 0.03y ends up being 0.01y. And then we also have the 4,800. So 0.01y plus 4,800 equals 5,600. Subtracting 4,800 from both sides gives us 0.01y equals 800. And dividing that by 0.01 gives us 80,000. So at this point, we know y is 80,000, and if we go up to our let statements, that was the amount invested in the CD. So we know that you invested $80,000 into the CD. We also have to figure out how much you invested in the savings account. But if you had $240,000 in total to invest and $80,000 to invest in the CD, that leaves $160,000 for the savings account. So we get $160,000 there. If you can't do that in your head, or if you want to just continue with substitution, we can take the equation x equals 240,000 minus y, and we can make the substitution that y is 80,000, and 240,000 minus 80,000 ends up being 160,000. So that means that you invested $160,000 into the savings account. We'll end by stating our conclusion. The problem asked, if you earned $5,600 in interest after 1 year, how much did you deposit in each account? We can say you deposited $160,000 in the savings account and $80,000 in the CD. And that is our final answer.